Miracles through the brown scapular. Stories of the wonderful ways which God has shown His mercy through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and that great sign of salvation, the brown scapular. Chapter 1. Introduction. The brown scapular of Our Lady of Mount Carmel has been a sacramental which God has been pleased to work many miracles through. No doubt, because to wear the brown scapular is to honor God's mother, which He repays with great generosity. The ancient order of the Carmelites, who find their origins from the followers of the prophet Elias on Mount Carmel, received visits from the Blessed Virgin and even held holy conversations with her. The visits of Our Lady to the hermits on Mount Carmel gave the good brothers a great devotion to her, and they were the first to build a church in her honor. These facts are according to the older copy of the Divine Office from the fourth lesson of Matins for July 16th. The faithful called the Order of Mount Carmel the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel. When the order was transplanted to Europe around the time of the First Crusades, this title was recognized by popes. Not only did she grace the good hermits with visits during her life, but after her glorious assumption into heaven has continued to confirm her affection for the order and has hastened to the aid and protection of the order when there has been need. One such occasion happened in England, in the city of Chester, in the year 1317. The Carmelites had erected a monastery in the city and were generally known by their customary name, Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel. This glorious title, however, offended some of the citizens, who began to murmur against the religious, and to accuse them of presumption in taking a name that they could not be worthy of. A strange thing happened then. Several of the more bitter enemies of the order died suddenly, and most of the others were stricken down by various diseases. The town seemed to be under a scourge from heaven. The governor of the city, the abbot of St. Bamberg, grew alarmed and ordered a public procession to be held in order to appease God's wrath. The Carmelites were requested to assist in the solemn procession. During the procession, as they passed a statue of the Blessed Virgin, which was held in great veneration, they all bowed their heads and saluted the Blessed Virgin, saying, Ave Maria. The statue, in the presence of all the population, bowed its head in return, and elevating the hands and extending the fingers, pointed to the Carmelite friars, saying in a loud voice, These are my brothers. These words were uttered 3 times in succession. The miracle, as may easily be supposed, caused a great sensation, especially as the dread scourge of sickness disappeared as suddenly as it had come. The whole affair was thoroughly investigated by Rome, and several popes have recognized this occurrence. If she hastened so quickly to protect her brothers from scoffing and mocking, how much more will she help those robed in her garment against the assault of hell? Knowing what we do about the history of the Order of Mount Carmel, it is no strange thing that St. Simon Stock received the great promise of the scapular, that all who wear this shall not suffer eternal fire. Favors from Our Lady are daily visible about us, but by all save a chosen few, they pass by unheeded. We hear from time to time of special acts of protection, of answers to prayers and various blessings. These incidents deepen devotion, increase our confidence and trust in the intercession of our loving Mother Mary, and offer in a small way to the honor of our most dear Queen. The stories in this audiobook have mostly been taken by published periodicals of the Carmelite order in the 1800s, in which they had compiled numerous miracles from various sources, including letters, newspaper articles, books, and the such like. This is only a small selection of the numerous stories of conversions, preservation from danger, restoration of health, and most importantly, the grace of dying a good death that God has been pleased to work through the scapular of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. We hope that these stories will deepen your devotion to the brown scapular, and that you will always wear it with great reverence, kiss it with great tenderness, and give thanks to God for being enrolled in the confraternity of the brown scapular. And if you do not wear the brown scapular, we hope that after listening to these stories, you will rush out to get one and become enrolled. O Virgin of Mount Carmel, thou didst promise Saint Simon Stock that anyone who died wearing thy brown scapular shall not suffer eternal fire. Grant them, we beseech thee, the grace to die wearing it, and protect us at the last moments of our life with the last sacraments. O Mother, pray for me that, when I go before the judgment seat of God, that your merits may be applied to the penalty due to my sins, and that I escape the punishments of purgatory. Amen. Our Lady of Mount Carmel, pray for us. Chapter 2. Healings of Body and Soul obtained through the brown scapular. John Baptist Castile, an honored inhabitant of Prague, and one of the most able magistrates of that city, was sadly deficient in one regard. Not knowing the many advantages attached to the wearing of the brown scapular, and ignorant of the countless marvels wrought through its efficacy, he often chose as a subject of ridicule his pious wife's devotion to this most celebrated sacramental. The mortifications she practiced in honor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the frequent exercises of devotion so dear to her fervent heart, were something he could not understand. One day, when he was almost unbearable with ill reproaches and railings, his wife said to him, "Take care lest your conduct draw upon you the wrath and punishment of your Creator." After only a little time had lapsed, he started to suffer from inflammation of the eye, and total blindness claimed him as a victim. Almost 2 months passed drearily away, and John still sat in a darkness which utterly refused to yield to the untiring efforts of the most skilful optometrists. But happily the light of divine grace penetrated his soul, and, entering into himself, he turned to our Lord and to his Blessed Mother, and promised to make amendments to his life. He asked for a priest, and upon the arrival of a zealous father he made a good confession, and received Holy Communion with the utmost fervor and devotion. The priest, who was of the Carmelite order, spoke to him of the graces, benefits, and privileges of the Holy Scapular, and immediately he had the greatest desire to be invested. Scarcely was the ceremony concluded than Mr. Castile recovered his sight, and since that happy day, January 15th, his health was better than ever before, and he was enabled to resume his duties as a magistrate to his great satisfaction and gratitude. Not alone were the members of his family, the physicians and specialists, witness of this unexpected cure. The whole city of Prague testified to its truth, and united with the grateful servant of Mary in drawing up a memorial with a full account of the miraculous event. The following comes from a letter from a Carmelite missionary in France. While engaged in preaching the Lenten services in Paris last Lent, I received many persons into the confraternity of the scapular of our holy order. I also preached a sermon on the subjects, as I always do on such occasions. Generally speaking, the Parisienne is either all good or all bad. I cannot describe to you the fervor, the noble simplicity, and the sincere devotion of the hundreds who responded to my appeal. I have given the scapular at the same time to women of the people and to society ladies, to laboring men and gentlemen of the upper classes, to simple soldiers and to their superior officers, who came publicly to ask to be enrolled. I can still see before me a captain who, on leaving the altar railing, turned to me to ask a question. "Father," he said, "you spoke of 2 obligations and 2 privileges." I repeated the explanation of the Sabbatine privilege. "Thank you," he answered, and I saw a big tear stealing its way into his fierce mustache. A landlady could not resolve on a necessary sacrifice, and yet I told her, "You must do it. It is necessary. Take the scapular of Carmel, and you will see a miracle." A few days later, the miracle had been accomplished, and her idol lay broken on the ground. From the same Parisian parish, a servant girl sent me the following letter. "Reverend Father, a humble domestic wishes to thank you for receiving her into the scapular of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. For years I have suffered from a cruel disease. I am so happy today to be able to tell you that since I wear the scapular, all suffering and pain has ceased. I suffer no longer. I made a novena of thanksgiving to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, nor do I forget every morning and evening to thank her for the graces which she had obtained for me. How happy I am to have received such a favor from the hands of our Blessed Mother Mary. Some 18 years ago, a young girl was invested with the brown scapular after receiving her first communion, and for a time was faithful in her prayers to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Her home training and school influence were far from Catholic, and the poor child soon grew careless in her prayers, and consequently fell into small sins, and small sins led to greater ones. The sacraments, Holy Mass, and prayers were almost entirely ignored, the neglect of which, together with the influence of evil companions, added each year new sins to her already well-filled list. The ever-busy enemy of our salvation lost no time nor opportunity in trying to drag this child's soul down to spiritual death. But mark well, dear readers, she dates her first fall from the time she discontinued her prayers of the scapular. 11 years of lost time to her passed thus with an occasional confession, a lukewarm communion, and no amendment. When through the mysterious workings of divine providence this poor child's eyes were opened to the unhappy state of her soul and her perilous mode of living, our dear Lord was pleased to call her back through the scapular, which she had unfortunately cast aside for the alluring and hollow vanities of a fleeting world. For 5 years she struggled against sin, often falling and very often disheartened at the thought of her sinful ingratitude to her Maker. She prayed earnestly to the Sacred Heart, implored the help of the saints, but had little devotion to Mary, the Queen of Saints. Thus her progress in amendment of life was slow, so much so that she strove by every available means to overcome herself and advance in Christian perfection. Her confessor urged her to have recourse to Mary, which she did by constant prayer and careful reading. About this time she contributed, through a friend, a small sum to the building fund of the hospice, and received in return a card on which was a miraculous picture of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and a beautiful prayer, with which she was so impressed that she committed the prayer to memory and recited it daily, together with the prayers proper to the scapular. It was while reciting this prayer that Our Lady of Mount Carmel made known to this girl that she had been unfaithful. The glorious Queen of Heaven had watched over this child all these years and was only waiting to be called upon for aid. Chapter 3. Rescued out of prison. The year is 1245. The graces for Count Felix de la Roque and his young wife Blanche. Everything tended to make their lives bright and happy, and grief, with careless kindness, seemed to pass them by. A beautiful home, tenants who looked up to them with admiration, respect and love, a loving child, and above all, the priceless treasure of a living faith. These were the gifts lavished by a bountiful providence upon this happy pair. The Countess was the godchild of the illustrious Queen Blanche, and the Count was devoted heart and soul to his king. In the education of the little Felix, his loving mother always took as a model her royal godmother, and many a time she would assure the boy that, deeply as his death would grieve her and cast a gloom over their now happy home, she would far rather give him to God and his guileless innocence than see him live to stain and blacken his soul with sin. The poor regarded Lady Blanche as an angel. Her purse was ever open to relieve their wants, her aid was ever at their service in sickness, and the most repulsive malady did not deter her from hastening to their side. The rich admired her for her beauty and grace, but still more for the bright example she set them. They sometimes tried to imitate it, or resolved to walk in her footsteps at some future time. Count Felix was too a loyal subject, and too good a Christian not to place his services and his purse at the disposal of the king. Even though the thought of him leaving to go on crusade made his noble wife desolate, far from seeking to change his resolution, she urged him on rather, and frequently by her wise suggestions aided her beloved husband, now a crusader and a soldier of the cross. and then came the bitter hour of separation. After a most loving farewell, the Count, noble knight that he was, followed by a numerous and chivalrous retinue, set out, full of high hopes and ardent resolves, with his king, Saint Louis, of France, on the 7th Crusade. The same crusade in which Saint Louis would eventually lose half of his army by disease and defeat, be taken himself prisoner, and languishing for a time under the Saracen iron rule, before he was ransomed himself and the remnant of his troops. The cross was heavy upon Count Felix on this crusade, as you will learn. He had borne himself all throughout that fateful 7th Crusade with a bravery and heroism which scarce can be described. Our Lady's Knight, his soldier comrades styled him, for he never went upon the battlefield without specially recommending himself to Mary, wore a large silver medal next to his heart, and had a small picture of our Blessed Mother painted upon his shield. At last he fell, pierced by the lance of a Moslem chief, and was left upon the field for dead. Here the protecting care of the Queen of Heaven was first evinced, for when, later on, the cruel foe began to heap indignities on their lifeless victims, it was found that Felix still lived. The lance had glanced aside, turned from its course by the medal which lay next to his heart, and now his true misfortunes began. His captors dragged him to prison, thrust him into a dungeon, and tore from his bruised form whatever of value met their gaze. One of his most precious treasures was a rosary with a golden chain and ruby beads. The rubies had always reminded the pious Count of the drops of blood which in the Garden of Gethsemane ran trickling down from our agonized Lord, and the large ruby in the center of the crucifix of a drop of blood from his sacred heart. This they took, also a miniature of his wife, exquisitely painted and set in a frame of precious stones. The Count seemed to have inspired his captors with a special hatred, for not another prisoner was treated with such unvarying cruelty. When the king sent to inquire as to his fate, and offered to ransom him regardless of the cost, he was invariably met with the assurance of his death, and the weary months dragged on. The foul air of his prison cell affected his health, and the work which he had led forth to do was too much for his strength. In hunger and thirst, and much watching, beneath the burning rays of an Egyptian sun, this heroic soldier of the cross toiled on. Not a murmur escaped his lips. To the mocking and jeers of his tormentors he uttered not a word. Our heroic knight was given assurances of his freedom and a happy meeting with his wife and child if he would but mock and scoff at our Lord Jesus Christ, which he always refused to do fearlessly. Meanwhile, his beloved wife hoped against all odds, and clung to the belief that her husband still lived on. All her works of charity, all her prayers, tended to this one end. She was very devoted to the holy souls, and after praying for them or assisting at Mass for their release, she would beg them not to forget her dear husband, who was now in prison, whom she loved so well. At times, when her courage started to falter, the saintly chaplain of the castle would bid her renew her prayers to the Comfortress of the afflicted, who would surely protect her husband and watch over him in that far-off land. But the world awoke to the year 1251, and the fame of the new devotion resounded throughout the church. It penetrated to France, and Lady Blanche was among the first to have herself enrolled in the confraternity of the Brown Scapular, together with her child. She had the name of her husband inscribed therein, that he might have an additional claim on the protection of Mary, and her confidence was not misplaced. After a day upon which the ferocity of his tormentors vented its worst cruelty, Count Felix fell upon his knees, and with a fervent prayer to the Blessed Virgin and her divine Son, in whose honor he had become a soldier of the cross, he resigned himself wholly into their sacred hands, to live or to die. At that moment, a venerable man in the garb of a monk appeared before him, and placing a scapular around his neck, opened the prison door and bade him go in peace. He knew nothing more until he found himself in his home, his own dear home, thanks to the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and her devout client, Saint Simon Stock. Chapter 4. The Brown Scapular and Deliverance from Unexpected Accidents. A Letter to a Priest. Some time ago a man named Strong jumped from a coal train which was crashing through a trestle about 60 feet high. As he leaped, he cried, "Mary, help me!" And he escaped without a hurt. He said that he believed the scapular saved him. A case of protecting love. When leaving home last spring to enter into business in Buffalo, the mother of a young man placed about his neck a scapular. Despite not having much faith in the brown scapular, he still wore it constantly. Last August, he stood one day near a large pile of lumber, taking down the names and the time of work from one of the men who had bent down to tie his own shoe. Suddenly, a shout from a man on the lumber pile caused both to look up. The boards were leaning forward, about to lose their balance. The poor workman ran from the toppling lumber, but before he could reach a point of safety, he was engulfed by the boards. The young man who wore the scapular, by some instinct he could not explain, ran to one side and avoided the deadly crashing of the lumber boards. He can claim no cause of escape other than the protecting love of Our Lady, and because of this, he resolved to always wear the scapular henceforth. A young girl was playing by a fast-moving river on iron grating, when suddenly the gate on which she stood gave way and she fell into the water, with the iron gate grabbing around her foot. The bed of the stream at this point was a considerable depth and was confined between two walls. Nay, more, the current was extremely swift, and lower down dashed onto the double arches of a bridge. How could this girl, with the grate the whole time around her feet, swim in such a place? How could she survive? And yet, she was there for 10 minutes. It was inexplicable. But the heroine, in the fullness of her faith, explains it thus: "My first thought was that I would have drowned. Soon I remembered the power of Mary, and fervently cried aloud, 'Blessed Mother, save me! I wear the scapular.' And that dear mother heard my prayer." A young man was preparing to go on a fishing excursion. While dressing, he thought he would leave off his scapulars, as the cord was considerably frayed. He mentioned this fact to his sister. She chastised him, and after a good deal of persuasion, induced him to wear the scapulars. During the day, the boat which held this young man and his companion capsized. The companion could swim, but the other could not. The first named said he would bring him safe to shore. He took a cramp, however, and went down to rise no more. Our young man was rescued after going down once or twice. When he was brought to shore and his clothing removed, it was found that although his apparel was soaked through, the scapulars were perfectly dry. This was noted, not by Catholics, but by Protestant rescuers. It is safe to say our young man will never think of leaving off the scapular again. The following incident is from the life of Father Bador, S.J., in an extract from a biographical notice which appears in the Annals of the Society of Jesus. One of the most terrible railway accidents in France occurred in the Versailles Railway in 1842. Among the few passengers who escaped with their lives was a young barrister from Ussel, François Badouar, who was preparing for his degree as a doctor of law in Paris. At the depot, something happened which made him change his compartment. He had already taken his seat in the coach when he noticed that the conversation of his fellow passengers, 3 libertines, was worse than loose, and at the risk of not finding another seat, he stopped the conductor, who came to close the door, descended, and with great difficulty found a seat in another compartment. "I shall be less comfortable," he thought, "but I would rather suffer some inconvenience than to be obliged to be in bad company." At the moment of the terrible collision at Bellevue, although bruised, he succeeded in disengaging himself from the wreck and jumping on the roadbed, just as his coach was enveloped in flames. Dragging himself along on hands and knees, he succeeded in climbing up the embankment, and then crawling through the fence. A little further on he fell, exhausted, and lost consciousness. After a while, when the sharp pain in his foot woke him, he found himself stretched on the ground in the midst of a vineyard, without help in sight. He began to pray. As night approached, noticing a lantern, he shouted for help and was heard. He was brought to the Necker Hospital, where Dr. Netlau was examining his foot. He himself was looking for his scapular, and when he found it on his breast, showing the image of the Blessed Virgin, he said, "Behold the one who saved me." Several papers of the period relate these words. The coach, which he had abandoned on leaving the depot, was completely annihilated with all of its passengers. But Francis Baudouin was not yet out of danger. The fracture of his foot extended from ankle to knee. Several little bones were crushed. For a while it seemed as if the gangrene had set in, and the sick man was placed before the alternative of choosing amputation or death. He accepted all with perfect resignation. But God destined Francois for a long life to be spent in his service and promoting his glory, and was satisfied with his acceptance of the sacrifice demanded. The skill of Dr. Natlau triumphed. The foot was saved, but remained feeble, often painful. 7 weeks after the accident, the young barrister, walking on crutches, came to the Jesuit church, there to make a public communion of thanksgiving. An interior voice kept urging him to consecrate the life which had been so wonderfully spared, to the sole service of the great God who had been so merciful. He made a retreat in secret, and concluded to give himself to God without reserve. Returning to Ussel, he gave all his possessions to the poor, and succeeded in gaining the consent of all his people, excepting his father. Not being able to overcome the opposition of his father, he escaped his vigilance one night, by crawling out a window on the first floor of the house. He went to his older sister, Mrs. Boulette, and begged her to console his father. He then took the stagecoach, and arriving at Toulouse, entered the novitiate of the Jesuit fathers. Soon after, a happy change took place in the heart and mind of his father, and the young man was left undisturbed in peace and tranquility of his religious life. Chapter 5. Deliverance from Unexpected, Violent Deaths. A young German priest of the Society of Jesus in England writes, in 1887, that a certain lady, whose sons were educated at a Jesuit institute, told him the following. A much respected physician, together with his wife, were members of the Masonic Lodge, in which he was holding a high position. Both he and his wife were Protestants and had no children. One day, during the octave of the Feast of the Assumption, the wife went into a Catholic church and prayed fervently, asking Almighty God to bless her with a child. And so it happened that when her time was up, she gave birth to a child. But the child took ill, and she conceived the idea that it might be her duty to have the child baptized. After it was baptized by a Catholic priest, it recovered, and a short time afterwards, the physician and his wife embraced the Catholic faith. One evening, when, after paying a visit to the priest, the doctor was on his way home, another doctor and a Freemason, who had been lying in waiting for him, stepped up in front of him, held up a revolver, and shot at him, aiming for his head. The shot was heard, and a crowd gathered around the doctor who had fallen to the ground. He was examined, and it was found out that the bullet had penetrated his clothes and had left an impression on the skin, without doing any further damage. The lady who relates this to the priest said that she had witnessed the latter part of the story with her own eyes. The good Catholic doctor was wearing the scapular at the time he was attacked. A Christian named Joseph Gemonat was on his journey towards Baghdad. He traveled on horseback unaccompanied through the desert of Kilia, in which there are many lions. Whilst nearing Simona, Joseph suddenly heard the roar of the dreadest beast, and in another moment saw it furiously rushing towards him. The poor traveler abandoned all hope of escape, and his horse stood still and shook with fear. Death appeared certain. Joseph recommended his soul to God, and then taking his scapular from his breast, held it before the lion and said, "In the name of the Blessed Virgin, I command thee to do me no harm." At this, the lion stood still, ceased to roar, turned, and fled. The prefect apostolic, together with many of the people of Baghdad, listened to the story of Joseph and bore testimony to its veracity. Thus, as on many occasions, was verified the promise of our mother that the scapular is a safeguard in danger. If Our Lady can surely save us from a lion by wearing this scapular, think of the protection she offers against our adversary, the devil, who, as a roaring lion, goeth about seeking whom he may devour. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 through 9. Chapter 6. Conversions through the brown scapular. The commandant of the military division, Major Eugene K., had married a baroness who was a member of the non-united Greek Church. That's the Greek Orthodox. The bride had already been divorced from a former husband, her religion having allowed it. The major, therefore, on wedding the baroness, fell away from the Catholic Church, which forbids such marriages. Years later, the major became very ill, and his cure seemed hopeless. His wife, whose first husband had died in the meantime, did all in her power to save the life of her present husband. The efforts of the most skillful physicians were in vain. In his helpless condition, the sick man turned towards God and his Holy Mother. The writer visited him on several occasions, and, to his great joy, beheld on the walls of the sick chamber a picture of Our Lady of Lourdes, and over the bed a vessel with holy water. Around the neck of the patient was the brown scapular in a small medal, which he had received from his pious mother when he was about to enter the army. The priest asked the wife, who was a pious woman although a non-united Greek, whether her husband was anxious to return to the bosom of the Church from which he had gone astray. She replied that the major was very desirous of re-entering the Church, and the sooner he did so, the better it was for him. After he made a profession of faith, the priest gave him the last sacraments, and the edifying manner in which the dying major received could not be described. With looks of childlike joy and gratitude, he repeatedly showed the holy scapular to the priest, which he frequently presented to his parched lips. "This has brought me happiness. This has obtained God's grace," he exclaimed. All fear of death left him. In fact, he yearned to go and be enrolled in the celestial army. After 10 days he died a most peaceful and edifying death. The bereaved widow asked to be received in the Catholic Church, saying that she could not keep from joining a religion which made death so sweet and peaceful. An American general, well known for his military skill and bravery, became a convert to the Catholic Church during the Civil War. The circumstances which accompanied and followed his conversion were so peculiar that they deserve to be recorded. One day, while a big battle was raging, the general saw a soldier fall near him. He sent help to him at once and demanded information as to his condition. To his surprise, he learned that something very strange had happened. The ball, which went straight for the heart of the soldier, had been deflected by a scapular which the soldier wore, and turning aside, had inflicted only a very slight flesh wound, which would soon be healed. The general, a Protestant, was so struck by this incident that he carefully investigated the fact, and was convinced that only the goodness and power of the Mother of God could explain this wonderful happening. He found no rest until he had become a Catholic. At the end of the war, he returned to his home, a little troubled about the reception which his Protestant wife might give him if she heard of his conversion. He had not the courage to tell her. The first Sunday after his return, he heard the bells of the Catholic Church ringing for Mass. Saying something to his wife about the need of a barber, he left the house and went straight to the church. The usher brought him to a pew and assigned him a seat. The general, bending his head devoutly, said his prayer with profound recollection. A lady arrived who took a seat in the same pew, but the general was so absorbed in his devotions that he did not notice her. It was only when the priest had said the Ite Missa Est and given benediction that the general, rising and making the sign of the cross for the last gospel, noticed the lady at his side, who also signed forehead, lips, and heart with the cross. It was his own wife, who, unknown to him, had joined the church some time before. They had been hiding from each other the sweet secret of the King. You can imagine, dear listener, the holy joy which filled their hearts at this most blessed discovery. Chapter 7. Graces at the Hour of Death. A soldier of the garrison of the city of Luxembourg, while riding through the country, came across a Frenchman who appeared more like a rotten carcass than a human being. Several parts of his body had been corrupted, and emitted a most intolerable stench. The soldier, when he saw that the apparently dead man raised his hand, approached him and asked him if he was a Catholic, and desired the assistance of a priest. By repeatedly raising his hand, the Frenchman seemed to give an affirmative answer. The soldier hastened to the convent of the Carthusians. The prior immediately repaired to the spot and heard the confession of the dying man, who was then able to speak clear and intelligible words when before he could not. Having received absolution, he declared to the bystanders that, having been mortally wounded during a siege, he was left by his comrades as dead. He attributed his having remained alive in such a condition to the Virgin Mary, whose livery he wore. Then, pulling out a brown scapular, he kissed it repeatedly before happily departing this life. A young man, after ending his school days, exchanged his Christian life for one of wickedness. The reading of bad literature, the frequenting of bad company, the indulging in all kinds of sensual pleasures, etc. Giving himself over to such a life, he gradually sank lower and lower, until finally he was given to despair. As the general outcome of despair is suicide, he decided upon ending his life. He managed to obtain a revolver, then went out into the country and shot himself in the head. A man, who was working nearby, had heard the shot, went to the spot, and recognizing the self-murderer, went to the mother of the unfortunate. He gave her the weapon, saying, "Madame, here is the revolver which has killed your son but a few moments ago." These imprudent words struck the heart of the mother so heavily that she was on the point of losing her mind, and the bystanders had all they could do to keep her from throwing herself out of the window. While some were consoling the mother, others went to get the body of her unfortunate son. Did he die suddenly? No, he is still alive. The priest and the physician are called. The latter examines the wounds. The bullet went through the brains, and thus there is no hope, no salvation for this earthly life. The sick man now recovers consciousness, and the priest hears his confession and gives him the last sacraments. After that, the poor man makes one more effort to console his mother who, bathed in tears, is at the side of her dying son. He opens the clothes which cover his breast and shows her the scapular, the only sign of religion that he retained during his life of sin and vice. "In my earlier days," he said in a broken voice, "I used to pray to Mary, and this is the reason why she showed me mercy today." These were his last words, and all who heard them were convinced that the scapular had been his anchor of salvation. Some are careless in wearing their scapular. Some take it off and forget to put it back on. Others neglect to replace it immediately when it's torn. The following story should inspire one to be more careful. A lineman, while carrying some blocks on his shoulder, was struck by an approaching train and wheeled around, receiving a fatal blow on the head. He was carried by fellow workmen to the station, and while being examined, a Catholic who was present noticed that the man wore scapulars. He ran at once to St. Anne's Church for a priest. Meeting one of the fathers in his vestibule, he told him of the occurrence, and in a few minutes the priest was at the dying man's side preparing him for his last journey. After the last sacraments were administered, the man was placed in an ambulance to be taken to a hospital, but he died before en route. If not for his scapular, this poor soul might have gone to the judgment without the rites of the Church. The apostle of the poor and laborers, as Father Millerot was known, was conducting a mission in a prison in Paris. Having heard the confession of a female prisoner, he enrolled her in the brown scapular, and exacted from her the promise never to part with it. Some days after, he met this same woman in the courtyard of the prison. "How are you?" he asked. "Oh, Father, since I saw you last everything has gone wrong with me. I had hanged myself." "Hanged yourself, poor child," said the priest. "Yes, hanged myself. My associates here had accused me of an infamous deed. They all cried, 'You are abominable!' I was furious thereat, and excited to the utmost. I ordered not to outlive this disgrace. I hastened to the cistern in order to jump in, but felt forcibly kept back. Then I went to the attic to hang myself, and suspended myself from a large hook. I was well nigh choked, and noticed my throat contracting. At this moment I raised my heart to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and the rope snapped asunder." Another instance related is that of a man who, failing in honesty and fearing arrest, decided to commit suicide. He communicated his intentions to the same priest, who said, "At least do me one favor. Take the scapular and promise me not to take it off." "Father," said the man, "I promise it because you have been so kindly disposed towards me." Then he left. To himself the priest said, "My friend, you may attempt to kill yourself, but you will not die." Some days after this, the unfortunate man was overcome by a temptation of despair. In order to carry out this awful design, he leapt into the Seine. He couldn't swim. He tried twice to keep under, but in vain. The scapular had saved him. He became ill and was converted. An aged officer, whose age reached far into the 90s, became an out-and-out skeptic and lost the faith by reading the works of Voltaire. He became suddenly ill. All his friends tried to persuade him to receive the holy sacraments, but in vain. A priest sent him a scapular, enclosing a note saying, "You will do me a great favor by wearing this." The old officer did as requested. The Mother of God then showed her power and maternal love. After taking the scapular, the officer devoutly confessed his sins, received Holy Communion, and until the end persevered in his devotion to Our Blessed Lady of Mount Carmel. One of the Carmelite missionary in India narrates the following facts published in the Chronicles of Carmel. The evil one, seeing his reign diminish day by day, and that especially the dying escaping him, seeks to revenge himself in 1,000 ways. His most common and perfidious attack consists in suggesting to the dying neophytes to take off the scapular of Our Lady. I will tell you of 2 cases in my experience, one consoling and the other terrible. Marie, the mother of my chief catechist, Jean, was on her deathbed. All at once she lifts her hand to her shoulder, and pointing at the scapular of Mount Carmel, she cried out, "Take it off! Take it off! It is burning me! It is that which is making me so sick! It is killing me!" "No, dear mother," said her son Jean, "it is the devil who is deceiving you. To drive him away, we will all say the rosary for you." The attendants fell on their knees and recited the rosary. The prayer being finished, the poor sick woman persisted in wishing to have the scapular removed, which, as she said, was burning her most painfully. Again the rosary was said, without rendering her more quiet. It was only after the rosary had been said 8 times that she ceased to importune the assistants to remove the scapular. She became more and more tranquil, and her cries, her sufferings, and her struggles ceased, when suddenly she fell into a kind of ecstasy and cried out, "Oh, look, look, behold, the Blessed Virgin is coming to me. She recognizes me as her daughter, because I wear the scapular. Oh, thank you, my dear children, 1,000 times for keeping it on me." And the child of Our Lady of Mount Carmel expired calmly and peacefully. Alas, Paul, one of my Christian children, unfortunately did not find such charitable souls around his deathbed. The poor boy became seriously ill. I visited him day after day and administered the last sacraments to him, which he received with the utmost devotion, answering himself all the liturgical prayers. Obliged to leave him in order to continue my round of sick calls, I recommended to his parents not to take off the scapular and the little crucifix that hung around his neck. After I was gone, he entered his last agony. Suddenly Paul, who had been completely exhausted and immovable, makes a supreme effort and with feverish hands tries to seize and pull off the scapular and crucifix. But his dying hands are powerless. He moves his lips and his tongue, plainly asking to have these blessed objects removed. His pagan mother hastens to take off the cross and the scapular, and at a moment after, Paul dies. The news of Paul's death, and the distressing circumstances attending it, soon spread through the whole district, and filled my Christians with fear. Only today, at one of our meetings, one of them in name of all addressed me on the subject. "Father," he said, "when we fall sick, we beg of you to give us strong scapulars and to fasten them well around our necks. And we pray, do not leave us to the mercy of our pagan relatives. Appoint some fervent Christians to remain on guard at our bedside, relieving each other from time to time, in order to keep us from falling into this terrible temptation, and to prevent us from losing our faith at the last moment." To God's providence, one person in Montreal, after hearing the efficaciousness of the brown scapular in a 20-minute homily, noted down some words of a priest who was a hospital chaplain in one of the principal Catholic hospitals of the diocese. During the years that I have been a chaplain to a hospital which is, as you know, to a great extent, the receptacle of persons injured by this innumerable accidents occurring daily, almost hourly, in our great commercial city, I can truly say, from my own personal observations, that of the Catholic working men or others, the victims of accidents, constantly being conveyed to that hospital, those who died on the way were brought in dead were without scapulars, while, on the other hand, and in all cases, those who were clothed with the garment of the Queen of Heaven were brought in alive and lived long enough to receive at least some, and frequently all, of the last sacraments in full possession of their faculties. This fact struck me so forcibly that I made a point to speak of it to the sisters in charge of the hospital, asking if they had noticed it. They replied that they had not only noticed it individually, but had more than once spoken of it amongst themselves as the common experience of all. What a consolation for those who have the happiness of wearing the scapular of Carmel! What an encouragement to wear it reverently and worthily in purity of life and fervor of devotion. Chapter 8. Saved from Fire. Father Guilhon writes, "My parents sent me to a well-known seminary to finish my studies. I had just entered philosophy. On the feast of the Assumption, 1811, when I was invested with the scapular, the ceremony did not take place until the evening. The various exercises of the house prevented me from reciting certain prayers which the confraternity were in the habit of saying through devotion every day. The hour of retiring came. I did not remember the omission until I had already laid down and was about to extinguish a candle, which, through a sort of timidity, I had left burning up to that time. I then placed it near my pillow without a thought of the possible consequences, and proceeded to recite the forgotten prayers. It was about 9 o'clock when I finished and fell fast asleep, and almost 10 when I awoke. My first thought was of the taper so thoughtlessly left burning, and I sat up in an instant, only to find myself in the midst of fire and smoke. The taper laid fallen over and set the pillow on fire. The mattress was burned, the headboard was charged and blackened. The room was so full of smoke that as soon as I opened the door to call for aid, the corridor was filled. As to myself, I was not injured in the least. Not a hair on my head was burned. The physician was astonished the next day when he saw the traces of the conflagration in my room, that I had escaped so thoroughly. He said that one would think if I had been spared by the fire, the thick smoke would have suffocated me. I cannot think with calmness upon that night. What a tragedy might not have been the result. I attribute my wonderful preservation entirely to Our Lady of the Scapular, that dear mother who vouchsafed to protect me, doubtless for the prayers in her honor which I was reciting at the very moment when slumber closed my eyes. On November 21st, The breaking out of a fire threatened the absolute destruction of Domnac, a small town in Bavaria. The wind was high, the night cold, for it was below zero and intensely dark. Everyone was in his home, most of the citizens asleep, and the only sound which disturbed the silence was the varied cadence of the wind as it brushed along. Now it would howl and shriek, as if a midnight demon rode the storm, then faintly moan as if lamenting the danger soon to come. Suddenly the alarm bell sounded, and the terrible cry, "Fire!" rang out and brought despair to every heart. The storehouse of a wealthy merchant was in flames. In it were stored 5,000 bushels of flour, straw, and other inflammable materials. In a few moments the entire population appeared upon the scene. All were eager to assist. This impulse was so general that men came from a great distance when they heard the alarm bell. Water was carried, but the fire had gained such headway, having reached the lay in the straw, that all hope of saving the town seemed at an end. The heavy slate roof, loosened by the heat, now swayed, and a new danger was to be apprehended. The adjacent buildings filled at the season of the year with chestnuts, drying upon large tables, awaited a speedy destruction. The flames had already caught the doors of a large granary, and desolation seized the anxious crowd. What was to be done? Suddenly a young girl, Anne Renaud, a fervent member of the Solidarity, moved by a happy inspiration, cried out that if a scapular of Our Lady were thrown into the fire it would quench the flames. She took off her own and handed it to one of the men, who, unable to throw it directly on account of the high wind, rolled it around a stone, and with unerring aim sent it into the blazing mass. At that instant the fury of the fire abated, and it seemed as if many gallons of water had been poured into the seething pit. True, it was not entirely extinguished, but it went no further. The door of the granary above mentioned was charred, but nothing more. At this single mark of Mary's protecting power, hope sprang up in every heart, but the most remarkable fact was yet unknown. At dawn, the town awoke to remember that it was the feast of the Presentation, and to renew their thanks to Mary. Willing hands were ready to remove the debris of the fire, which was smoldering still. What was their astonishment was to find the scapular amid hot coals and stones, of which the heat was so great that they could not touch them. Detached from the stone around which it had been twined, without a sign of the fiery ordeal through which it had passed the night before. The picture of the Blessed Virgin was perfect. Even the strings had been preserved. The scapular was placed at the feet of the Queen of Carmel in the chapel dedicated to her honor, where it can be seen by the faithful who daily come to pray at her shrine, and find therein a new motive for confidence in Our Lady of the Scapular. We find the same miraculous occurrence in several places. For instance, in 1599, June 15th, in Salerno, Italy, in the ancient kingdom of Naples. Fire broke out in the house of a baker, Jean Savent, from his heated oven, which he was at that very moment preparing to use. Terrified at the thought of the misfortune about to overwhelm them, his wife Beatrice, full of confidence in the Mother of God, threw her scapular into the flames with the fervent invocation, "O Lady of Mount Carmel, save us!" At that moment the fire was quenched, and the scapular, though it remained 4 hours in the heated oven, was not even scorched. The Abbey of Get of Toulon was favored in the same special manner. It occurred in 1639. A scapular was cast into a fire which threatened destruction to the building, and the flames were extinguished at once. The convent of Mont de Piété at Charité-sur-Loire, also in 1639, was preserved from fire in the same wonderful manner. At Angers, in 1644, a pastry cook beheld with dismay the impending loss of his earthly store, but the Queen of Carmel, through the efficacy of her favorite garment, came to the rescue, to the gratitude and joy of the poor man. In the same year, in the Isle of St. Aubin, Pont de Gay, a merchant named Chobot testified to a similar preservation from fire. The Gazette of Paris publishes these two miracles in detail. In 1648 we learn of the official attestation of the two nobles, Count de Belay and Baron de Soch, his son, that the Château de Ragun was most wonderfully saved from the destruction of fire through the efficacy of the scapular. The holy badge was cast into the flames, and the danger averted at once. In all these instances, the scapular came out intact from the fire. Innumerable examples of the same miracle come from every point. In the diocese of Rennes adds the indisputable testimony of a remarkable preservation from fire in 1564. A stable in the village near Tale, some dioceses, took fire, and great fears of the safety of the entire village were entertained. When the scapular was thrown into the flames, they sank down, and soon the blazing pile was dim and dark. 2 men who slept on in the midst of fire and smoke escaped uninjured, and the scapular was not burned, or even singed, although the heat was very great. In 1684 at Paris a fire occurred which attained such vast proportions that from the jeweller's establishment where it originated, it threatened destruction to that entire quarter of the city. When the relentless flames seemed about to engulf a beautiful church, St. Gervais, in their deep abyss, a solitary thought seized one of the beholders to throw his scapular therein. The conflagration ceased at that moment, and later on when the scapular was recovered, although it was found upon red-hot coals, not a sign of the fire was to be seen. My friends, God always speaks of supernatural truths through these natural miracles. It is very obvious to us, if Our Lady of the Brown Scapular can save us from the earthly fire, surely she can save us from the unquenchable fires of hell. This concludes our stories of miraculous events of the Brown Scapular. We hope these testimonies of miraculous events has increased your devotion, and that the next time you find yourself in danger, surrounded by fire, attacked unexpectedly, or dying, that you will call on Our Lady of Mount Carmel to come help you. My friends, never abandon this devotion, and never take it for granted. If you treasure this most precious gift, and hold it in high esteem, you will not only do good for your own soul, but silence the outrages of impious men. Like the late Cardinal Howard, who did have a great devotion to the scapular. When he was still an officer in the guards, it happened that one of his fellow officers found a scapular in the guard-room and carried it to the mess hall, where he held it up to ridicule. Finally, he suspended it on the gas jet overhanging the table. Lieutenant Howard came late that evening to supper, and he entered the room, and someone shouted, "Howard, here is something for you. Is it not something belonging to a papist?" "Of course," said Howard. "It is something belonging to my religion, something which I reverence and esteem, for the honor of which I would be ready to draw my sword." Thereupon he drew his sword from its scabbard, and held the scapular on the point. He then most devoutly kissed the scapular, afterwards placing it on his breast. None of his comrades dared to say a word. After this, Lieutenant Howard was more than ever esteemed by his fellow officers, since he was not ashamed to give expression to his religious convictions. May we too be ready to draw our swords for the honor of God and His most blessed Mother in this age of irreligion, and always thank and bless God for giving us the brown scapular, a shield of faith and a sign of salvation. This has been a production of Alleluia Audiobooks. To hear more Catholic audiobooks, homilies, or spiritual conferences, please visit us at alleluiaaudiobooks.com, or you can just Google Alleluia Audiobooks. We encourage and hope that you will make copies of this CD to hand out to your friends and family along with brown scapulars, which we are happy to give permission for, but we do ask that you do not alter the original audio. Thank you, and God bless.